Hi, I'm Paul Hsu from Northland College. I'm a professor of history there. I want to talk today about the history of psychology. And in particular, I want to explain that the history of the field of psychology, and in particular the field of treating mental illness, is really related to a much bigger cultural history in Europe and the United States. And that's focused on three different models of human nature, three models of what a human being is. And throughout Western history, from the Middle Ages to the present, Europeans and Americans and Australians and Canadians and whatever have basically had three different models of what a human being is. And these models have arrived at different times, and they've sort of at times been dominant in Western culture and civilization, and then other times have not been dominant. So I want to first talk about these three models of human nature and when they were sort of dominant. Then I want to go into the history of psychology and talk about how the different models have shaped psychology. So the first model is the soul-flesh model. And this model is, it emerged out of early Christianity in the early Middle Ages, and it was the dominant model of what people in Europe and later the United States thought about a human being was from about the 400s up until the mid-1700s. The soul-flesh model argues that a human being, it's explicitly Christian, this model, and it argues that a human being is made up of a soul which strives for God, for the sacred, and a body made of flesh, but that the body and the soul are not exactly in sync. The soul wants to connect to God, and the body wants physical pleasure. And so, according to this model, human beings are constantly kind of torn apart because they're constantly being torn in two directions. Their souls want to go this way, and their bodies want to go that way. And in particular, the body is trying to constantly get them to do things that their soul considers to be a sin. So the body is constantly wants sex, it wants food, it wants violence, it wants, get drunk, etc. All these bad impulses come from the body. And the soul is striving for God. And so the body and soul are sort of at war with each other. And so in the soul-flesh model, human beings are sort of never quite comfortable. And they're always in danger of becoming, doing sinful things, violent things, sexual things, etc. And so in the soul-flesh model, one of the assumptions is that you have to create a society around people that helps them to fight the urges of their own body, helps them to fight against sin. And so what you do in the Middle Ages was you would say, let's have a really strong church that controls society, and we'll have the laws built on church morality, etc. And everything will be built around God. And then we'll also have laws that really enforce morality, not just the laws that we think of laws today, but you want to enforce morality. So you want to have laws against blasphemy or heresy, and you want to have laws against adultery, and you want to have laws that enforce morality. Okay. In addition, proponents of the soul-flesh model argue that you have to have a social hierarchy. Everybody has to be under somebody else, so that everybody is sort of monitored and being disciplined and watched over by somebody above them. And so in the soul-flesh model, say in the Middle Ages, you would have children were absolutely under the authority of their parents, but wives were supposed to be under the authority of their husbands, and peasants were under the authority of aristocrats, and you had a church hierarchy with priests under the authority of bishops, under the authority of archbishops, under the authority of cardinals and the Pope. You had, and at the top of society, you had a king and a pope who were supposed to be the most, they were sort of chosen by God to run society because they were the most able to control themselves. But everybody else had somebody telling them what to do, somebody watching over them, enforcing morality on them. And this comes out of the nature of the soul-flesh model, because if everybody is constantly tempted towards sin, you have to set up social structures that prevent people from sinning. So that's basically the soul-flesh model. Now, later on, I'm not going to go into the whole history of the soul-flesh model, but later on, it would be challenged by these other two models in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. But the soul-flesh model would persist. And in the 19th century, the soul-flesh model was used to justify slavery in the American South by saying that God wanted black people to be under white people and God wanted hierarchy, etc. And so the soul-flesh model was used to justify slavery amongst the American South. And that justification of a racial hierarchy carried on after slavery, and there were religious justifications on the soul-flesh model for the Jim Crow laws, to keep black people in the place that God wanted them to be, etc. was the argument that people made with this soul-flesh model. And you see it today on the Christian right, the religious right, who argues that wives should be subordinate to husbands, and people should take the authority of religious leaders very seriously, and there are people on the religious right who still have a sort of a racial hierarchy idea in them. So the soul-flesh model is not the dominant model in our society today. Most people embrace one of the other models, but there's still a strain of the soul-flesh model that runs through American culture today. And so the soul-flesh model was there the entire time. The second model is the mind-body model. And this emerges during the scientific revolution in the 1600s with René Descartes and his mind-body split. But during the Enlightenment in the 1700s, it really becomes the sort of the cool new model that everybody embraces, and it becomes the dominant model in society in the 1900s, and it's still in many ways the dominant model in our society today. What's the mind-body model say? Well, the mind-body model says that a human being is basically a rational mind, a rational, free-thinking mind that's intelligent, can figure things out on its own, but that mind doesn't have any physical reality. It's not a physical thing. Then the mind is connected to a physical body. And this is why they often call this the mind-body split, because the mind is not physical, it's totally separate from the body, but it's connected to the body somehow. And the body is just a biological machine. It's a biological organism, and it runs according to the laws of nature. But what's crucial here is that in the soul-flesh model, the body is constantly leading people into sin, and it's constantly driving people to do all sorts of things. In the mind-body model, the body doesn't do any of that. The body is just a support system. It's just there. It doesn't make you do anything. And so in the mind-body model, the mind is free to do and think whatever it wants to, right? It's rational. It's not being influenced by the body much. And so it's free to do whatever it wants. And it's totally rational. So that's the mind-body model, and that becomes this is the model that people use to justify the American Revolution. This is the model that justifies, capitalism. This is the model that is used it's sort of the foundation of American society and European society in the 19th century and into the 20th century. The third model is the biological organism model, and this model also was first proposed. It was first proposed way back by Aristotle, but it was first proposed in European society in the 1600s also, but it was too radical, it was too crazy to be talked about seriously. And anybody who tried to write about this model, would their books would be banned, and they'd occasionally get thrown in jail, etc. And so it really wasn't a popular model until the mid-19th century, the 1800s, when Darwin published On the Origin of Species, and he really proposed this theory of evolution, that human beings, he proposed human beings had evolved from other animals. He actually proposed that in 1871 in The Descent of Man. But Darwinism gave the biological organism model a whole bunch of legitimacy, and so the biological organism model became a major sort of part of Western culture beginning in the 1870s, 1880s, and it's had a sort of an up and down career, but it's still there today as if you think about medical science or modern psychology, etc., it's built on this biological organism model. Because what the biological organism model says is that human beings are just a biological animal. We evolved from other animals. There is no mind or soul. There's simply a biological brain in a biological body. And moreover, that brain functions with, electrical impulses and chemical hormones and things like that. And all those things are governed by the laws of nature, right? And so the human mind, the human brain, human thought is all just a product of the biological body. And there's no gap between the mind and the body. There's no split between the mind and the body. It's a biological brain in a biological body, and the biological body influences and shapes what happens in the biological brain. And so, for instance, if you get tired, your thinking changes. If you have a fever, you get delirious and your thought processes change, etc. So the biological organism model argues that human beings are entirely biological. There is no soul. There is no, a disembodied mind. And we are not necessarily rational, right? Because one of the implications of the biological organism model is that because our thought processes are governed by the laws of nature, and our brain has a biological structure, there are synapses that are connected in certain ways, we can't just think whatever we want. We think the way our brain is wired to think. And so, for instance, if you flood your brain with alcohol or THC or something, it changes the way your brain functions, but in very predictable ways, right? And some people have even argued that we really don't have any free will. If the biological organism is true, they say, that means human beings, all of our thought processes are really just shaped. They are determined, and we really can't think anything other than what we think. We think we're free to choose to think whatever. We think we can make choices and things. But really, it's all biologically programmed at some level. So you could say, well, I can choose whether I want to drink coffee or tea or cola, but you're going to make that choice based on your preferences, and your preferences are probably hardwired into your brain that you like coffee or you don't like tea or you do like cola or whatever. And you really don't have a choice. You think you do, but you're always going to make the same choice, right? And so some people have argued in the biological organism that really biology determines everything about you. Biology is destiny. Okay. Now, other people have a different idea, and I'll get into that a little bit later, about what that biological organism implies. That maybe we do have some free will, or maybe we have enough, something close enough to free will so that it doesn't matter. But the biological organism model, so that emerges, with Darwin in the mid 1800s, the late 1800s. These three models have sort of fought it out then. I mean, the soul flesh model was the dominant one, was really the only model up until the 1700s. And then the mind-body model comes along, and the two sort of fight it out throughout the Enlightenment and the early 19th century, and the mind-body model pretty much wins, although there's still people who embrace the soul-flesh model. And then in the late 19th century, Darwinism comes along, and then the biological organism model challenges the other two. And it's really shaped a lot of things about our culture. And in fact, if you want to point to all of the sort of culture wars that we have in the United States today, you can lay them at the feet of those three biological models. Everything from, the controversies about abortion or gay marriage or transgender rights or Black Lives Matter and police brutality and prison reform or climate change or, the field of psychology or voting rights and gerrymandering, etc. All these things can be traced back to those three models, because the people who are on one side in the abortion debate are generally soul flesh people, conservative Christians. People on the other side of the debate are either biological organism or mind body model proponents. If you look at something like Black Lives Matter, you can make the argument that what you're seeing is that the controversy about policing of African Americans is in many ways about whether or not you think there should be a social hierarchy with black people showing deference. The soul flesh people, that's still a strong strain there, and they tend to defend the police. The mind body people who say everybody's equal and rational tend to say no, African Americans should be treated like everybody else. Things like gay rights, if you think the body is tempted towards sin and that God has created a social hierarchy for us, homosexuality doesn't fit into that. That's just considered a sin, so you shouldn't have gay rights. But if you think everybody is a rational mind who can choose what they want to choose, homosexuality is an individual issue, right? And in general, I can say that the mind-body model is the one that focuses the most on individualism, individual rights, individual choice, etc. So I'm not going to go into all the details on that, but these three models have shaped a whole lot about our culture. And they've shaped the history of psychology. And you can sort of imagine how, psychology is the study of how the human mind works. So those three models are going to have a profound impact on how you think the mind works. But I want to sort of look at the history of psychology through the idea of mental illness. How do people explain mental illness, right? So at first, the soul-flesh model was the dominant model in the Middle Ages up until the 1600s, 1700s. And so how does the soul-flesh model think about mental illness? Well, you remember, in the soul-flesh model, a person is made up of a soul that longs towards God and the sacred, and then a body that wants physical pleasure and sin. And so each human being is sort of torn apart by those things. And there's this larger struggle in medieval culture between God on the one hand and the devil on the other, right? Well, when people in the Middle Ages were confronted with somebody acting irrationally, acting with schizophrenia or psychosis or obsessive compulsive disorder or what have you, they didn't know how to explain that, right? The soul-flesh model says basically all the sinful bad things people do come from the body. Well, so there's a tendency to say, okay, it must be the body that's causing this. And they tended to think of mental illness as a kind of sin. Well, then the question is, why is this person like this? Why is this person, nobody else is acting that way? And basically there were two explanations given in the Middle Ages. One was satanic possession. The devil or a demon has taken over your body and is forcing you to do sinful things like swear or take all your clothes off and run around naked or try to rape somebody or have fantasies of murdering people or whatever the mental illness is. The devil is making you do it. The other option in the soul-flesh model is that God knows that you've already sinned so much in life, you're going to hell, and He's actually started punishing you already. So in this model, mental illness is actually the punishment for sins you've already committed. The sort of torment that mentally schizophrenics or somebody would have was seen as punishment from God for sins you'd already committed. And the assumption then was that the mentally ill were already damned to hell. They were already going to hell and God knew it, and that's why He was already punishing them. He wouldn't be punishing them if it was still up in the air whether or not they would be going to hell or not. One thing I want to make clear here is that in the Middle Ages, they wouldn't have called a lot of things that we call mental illness, they wouldn't have labeled as mental illness. They would have said, if someone had depression or anxiety, they would have just said that's just their personality. They're just kind of depressing personality, or they're kind of anxious, or whatever. So they wouldn't have recognized that as mental illness. And things like OCD, they might not have recognized as mental illness. But something like schizophrenia, hearing voices or something, they'd say, oh, that's demonic possession, right? Or psychosis they would clearly recognize that. So the only people who were really treated as mentally ill in the Middle Ages were the ones who had serious psychoses. Okay, and so when you talk about how they treated the mentally ill, you're really only talking about people with severe schizophrenia, psychosis, etc., things like that are obvious and you can't ignore it, and it causes serious disruption and even distress for the person suffering from it. So how did they handle this? Well, one thing they would try to do is exorcisms. They would try to bring in a priest and do a special ceremony to drive the devil out of the person. If that didn't work, then often the mentally ill wound up simply being locked up in asylums. And asylums were not a place, they weren't a mental hospital, they weren't a place where you got better. They were simply a place where society said, you're doing all sorts of crazy things and we can't handle you, so we're just going to lock you away. And the idea was that the mentally ill person was sinning, right? What if they're blaspheming and swearing at God, and what if they're trying to rape people, or what if they're trying to do murder? That's all sinful. Society can't tolerate that, so we've got to just prevent them from sinning. And they can't stop themselves. They're going to sin. And so mental asylums tended to be places that were close to prisons. You would simply put somebody in there. They would often be chained to the wall. They would be, they wouldn't take them out to get fresh air or anything. They wouldn't try to, bathe them very often. They would give them just enough food to keep them alive. And often, the people would be locked for years in these dank dungeons where it's cold and they don't have much clothing and they're fed, basically oatmeal and they're covered in their own feces, etc. There was no attempt to cure them. They had no idea how to cure them. And they were deemed to be either possessed by the devil or damned by God, so society didn't have any reason to want to be nice to them. And so they weren't. So under the soul flesh model, mental illness was either ignored, if it was just depression or anxiety or something, you would just live with your family and your family just dealt with it. It wasn't labeled mental illness. But if it was really serious, like a psychosis, you would be locked up in an asylum, which was a horrific place. But beginning in the late 1700s, the mind-body model starts to spread through society. A lot of people start writing out the mind-body model. And a number of people began to say, well, what are the implications of the mind-body model for mental illness? If people really are minds and rational minds and biological bodies, and it's not about sin and God and damnation, etc., what does that mean for mental illness? Well, the first answer people came up with, there was a guy named Pinel, P-I-N-E-L, who came up with something called the moral cure. And he basically said, if people are rational minds and they're acting irrationally, they have a mental illness, a psychosis or schizophrenia or something, clearly something has gone wrong here with the rational mind, or with the relationship between the rational mind and the biological body. And so there were a couple of theories about what caused mental illness then. Let me back up for a second and just talk about one aspect of the mind-body model. The mind-body model argues that people are born as a blank slate, a blank piece of paper. They have a bunch of rational ability, they can think, but they have no memories, no experiences or anything. So it's sort of like a computer that has, it's got a great internal processor and all that, but it doesn't have any software on it, so it doesn't do anything. Well, human beings, the mind-body model says human beings are like that. They have this amazing rational ability, they can think, but they have no experiences or memories or sensations, so they have nothing to think about. So babies are kind of inert. But over time, as you grow up, you learn, you get all sorts of physical sensations and experiences, and you start to study the world and figure out the world. And your rational mind starts to build up a sort of a picture of how the world works, and it develops your character. This is how I'm going to act in the world. This is what I think is the best way to act. Well, it's that model of developing over time that the moral cure addressed. They said, hey, maybe mental illness, if our character and our talents and our abilities and our mental processes develop over time through experiences, maybe somebody who's mentally ill had bad experiences, right? Maybe they were abused as a child, or maybe they had, who knows what disease or something that happened to them that changed the mental process. And so the idea then of the moral cure was that we had to sort of re-educate the person to act right? We just had to sort of teach them out of mental illness. And so you would suddenly, with Pinel and others, you would start to have, the asylums became nice places with rooms and sheets on the beds, and mental patients would be allowed to paint and do ceramics, and they would take long walks on the grounds, and they would play games, etc. And the idea was that if you could sort of retrain the person through experiences to be normal again, then they would eventually become normal. One other assumption, they weren't sure here with the moral cure, but one other assumption was that maybe there was something physically wrong with the person that was messing with their mind. The body was messing with the mind somehow. And so they thought maybe if you could eat really healthy foods and get the body super healthy, then whatever the body was doing to the mind would stop. Okay. Well, the moral cure was really popular in the early 1800s, but it didn't really do much to solve mental illness. Things like schizophrenia are not really treatable by teaching somebody how to paint and giving them regular meals. So the moral cure was really, lots of people were really excited about it when it first appeared, but then they were sort of like, well, it's not really doing much, right? Well, over the course of the 19th century, you saw a third, model come along. And I want to point out that I said that the biological organism model became a really prominent model after Darwin, but there were some very narrow ways that people did sort of embrace the biological organism model before Darwin. And one of these was in the area of medicine, that doctors tended to sort of think of human beings as biological organisms. They didn't talk about it as being the dominant idea in society or anything, but they sort of treated it that way. And there were a couple of key things that made people think in the 19th century that maybe, just maybe, human beings were biological organisms and mental illness was a biological illness. One of these things is that people began to, over the course of the 19th century, really study brains, and they began to study the structure of the brain and the structure of the skull, etc. And that led people to sort of wonder how the brain is related to thought processes, etc. But they didn't really have any way to test it or any way to figure out how the brain worked yet. But the one sort of insight in this came from the Phineas Gage case. And I don't know if you guys have studied Phineas Gage in here. It's a famous case from the 1840s where a guy was working on a railroad. They were building a railroad and they were blasting a tunnel through a mountain. And so they were using explosives, and they would drill a hole into the rock and put explosives in there and push the explosives in with a metal rod, and then they would light a fuse and run away and blow it up. Well, this guy, Phineas Gage, was working on this, and he accidentally set off the charge, and it sent about a 3-foot long iron bar, it was about an inch thick, straight through his skull. It went in through his cheek and went out the top of his head. And it took out a 1-inch cross-section of his brain. It just took out a big chunk of his brain. The weird thing was, this didn't kill him. This didn't even knock him out. He was entirely conscious. He felt the thing go through his head, and everybody's looking at him, and there's like blood pouring out of his head, etc. And he's talking. And so they take him to the doctor, and he's talking to the doctor, and the doctor is like pouring alcohol into his brain, into his head, into the hole in his head to sterilize it. And he survived. And eventually, the hole closed up in the top of his head, and he went on with his life. And it was just a freak that the bar had gone through his head in such a way that it didn't kill him. But what's really fascinating about it was that his personality totally changed. Before the accident, he had been the foreman at the age of 24 or something, a foreman on the crew. He was seen as totally responsible, level-headed, even-keeled kind of guy that you put in a leadership position. After the accident, he'd get angry, he argued with everybody, he'd become violent, he was sexually inappropriate with women, he swore all the time, he had no self-control whatsoever. And eventually he would die from an epileptic seizure, probably brought on by that accident, but it took years. Well, psychologists studied this and they said, oh my gosh, the part of his brain that got taken out must have been the part of the brain that handled social control. The part of your brain that handled doing social things, living by the rules. And so they realized that maybe parts of the brain actually controlled parts of your personality. And so this was a key clue, but of course they couldn't just go blowing metal bars through people's skulls at different angles to try to find out which parts of the brain did what. So it was just this one-off event. The Phineas Gage case was this tantalizing clue, but nobody knew anything more than that. Well, by that was the 1840s. Darwin comes along in 1859. By the 1880s, lots of people are saying, well, human beings are biological organisms. And so let's really figure out how the brain works. Well, they didn't have any way of studying the brain, right? They still just had the one thing with Phineas Gage. And a lot of people misunderstood Darwin. In particular, they thought that Darwin showed that biology was destiny. that evolution shaped everything about us. And that's not true. But they thought that at the time. They thought that that's what Darwinism meant at the time. And you can sort of see that, you know, the mind-body model says your experiences shape everything about you. And so the biological organism model being different, they said, well, no, your biology shapes everything about you. But because of that, one of the first ways that people tried to apply the biological organism model to actual mental illness was by using the idea of evolution. And they said basically maybe mental illness is like a hereditary problem with your genes, right? You inherit it, it came from evolution. Or maybe even, and some people suggested this, that mental illness is like putting evolution in reverse and going backwards, right? That evolution is leading human beings this way, but every once in a while there's somebody who sort of goes backwards in evolution and they have a mental illness. So that's great, I suppose, but that implies that there is no cure for mental illness because it's simply part of the evolutionary process and it's so part of a person there's no way you could change that. So that theory that mental illness was hereditary and was shaped by evolution was maybe interesting from a psychological point of view, but it didn't help treat mental illness at all. But there were actually a couple of interesting things that happened at about the same time in the late 19th century that did help treatment of mental illness. In particular, there's the sexually transmitted disease syphilis. If you don't treat it, I mean, today we can treat it with antibiotics, but if you don't treat it, it eventually gets into the spinal column and into the brain, and it can cause insanity. And in fact, syphilis was so widespread in the 19th century that this was one of the major forms of insanity, was caused by syphilis. And there was no cure for it, and people would get locked up in asylums, you know, and they'd try the moral cure, etc. Didn't do much. But one scientist, and I don't have the exact dates here, but I think it was the 1890s, got the brilliant idea, sort of he noticed that patients who had this type of mental illness from syphilis often seemed better after they had a fever. And so what he decided to do was he would infect patients who had this advanced form of syphilis, this mental illness caused by syphilis, he would infect them intentionally with malaria, because malaria causes super high fevers. And what he discovered, which just astonished everybody, was that once a patient had gone through a super high fever with malaria, their mental illness vanished. Because the mental illness was being caused by a bacterium in their brain, and the high fever killed the bacterium. And so this was the first time somebody had come up with sort of a biological cure for mental illness. Oh my gosh, we can actually cure this one. Now, you still have malaria, but so this was the beginning of a bunch of biological attempts to cure mental illness. So people are going to say, well, what else can we try? What else can we do to treat mental illness? And actually, over the course of the next 50 years, the late 1800s, early 1900s, people came up with a bunch of scientists using the biological organism model came up with a bunch of ideas about how they could cure mental illness. Now, some of these were pretty brutal. They all sort of worked, but they were often pretty brutal. One was, this guy would actually put people into a diabetic coma. And this actually helped calm down people with psychoses and schizophrenia. It didn't last very long, but it did kind of work for a while. Another one was they began to experiment with electroshock therapy. They began to give people enormous electric shocks, which often calmed down people and helped people with psychoses and schizophrenia, etc., but only temporarily. Another one is in the 1920s, they realized that you could drill a hole into somebody's forehead and take a little metal instrument and just sort of muck around in their brain, destroy a bunch of their brain right behind the forehead, and it actually dampened down strong emotions. So mental patients who had really, psychosis or whatever, that had strong emotional responses to things, suddenly became sort of emotionally flatlined if you gave them what was called a lobotomy. Later, they figured out that you could actually just take something like an ice pick and run it right up along the eye into the brain and sort of wiggle it around a little, and it would take 10 minutes to do a lobotomy. and they would be emotionally flatline ever after, which is really brutal and not a great cure for mental illness, but it did treat the symptoms to a certain extent. But it was finally in the 1940s and 50s that they began to discover drugs. They began to discover a number of drugs that would become true antidepressants and then antipsychotic drugs. They would discover things like Thorazine, and then later things like Xanax and what have you, Valium, those sorts of things. Those became actual treatments, but they're built on the biological organism model. This person is depressed, I'm going to give them a physical drug that alters the chemistry of their brain, and it's going to cure their mental illness, or at least make them less depressed. So the biological organism model then begins to really focus on medicine, psychoactive drugs, as cures for mental illness. But the mind-body model wasn't quite done yet. Because in the 1890s, there was a scientist named Sigmund Freud who came up with a theory of what the mind was like. And it was based on the mind-body model. Right? So the mind-body model says the body is biologically distinct as here, and then the mind is not biological, it's not physical, it's over there. Well, Freud said he thought that actually the mind, that disembodied, not physical mind, had a kind of a structure. He said that we can figure out how that thing works. Even though it's not physical, we can't study it, we can still figure out how it works. And in particular, Freud said that there were, the mind had three parts. He said there was one part called the id, I-D, id. And the id was just a bunch of subconscious urges. All your desires for sex or power or fame or fortune or another candy bar or whatever, all those urges come from your id. And those are unconscious. He says you're not aware of where these urges are coming from, because the id is not part of your conscious mind. Then Freud said, you've got another part of your mind called the superego. And the superego is basically the part of your brain that has learned all the rules of society, right? The part of your brain that tells you you've got to wear clothes before you go outside because people wear clothes outside. The part of your brain that says, no, I'm not going to punch him because I will be arrested for assault. The part of your brain that says, no, I'm not going to steal that because I'll get arrested for theft. The part of your brain that says, no, I'm not going to make a pass at my mother because you're not supposed to make a pass at your mother. The part of your brain that tells you what not to do because society says that's unacceptable. And that part of your brain is pretty much all conscious. You're aware of why you don't want to steal something because you're aware of the laws against theft, right? And the consequences. But Freud said there's a third part of your mind. And the third part of your mind is called the ego. And the ego's job is to balance off the urges that are coming out of the id and the rules of society that are coming out of the superego. And so, for instance, suppose you really want to suppose you really like power. Well, you could, try to murder a bunch of people and that would give you a sense of power, but your superego is going, no, you're going to go to jail, you're going to get the death penalty, don't do that. So maybe your ego says, well, why don't we satisfy the urge to power by running for president, right? That's a socially acceptable way to satisfy my id. And so, so the ego is constantly trying to channel all this energy, these desires coming out of the id, and find productive ways for that to come out, right? And so, Freud said all sorts of interesting things could happen. For instance, he said that maybe, somebody is really attracted to, suppose you have a woman who's really attracted to other women, but society says, no, women can't be sexually attracted to each other. So that woman channels her energy, instead of trying to have sex with other women, she channels that into painting flowers in a way that's really sexual, and it sort of satisfies her sexual urge for sex with women because she's painting flowers that look like female, sex genitals, and it's socially acceptable to paint pictures of flowers that are kind of sexually suggestive. Freud would say that's the ego trying to find a creative way to satisfy the desire of the id to have sex with women and the rules of society that women can't have sex with women, and so painting pictures that kind of look vaguely like female genitalia is a way to do it. Freud was very focused on sex, by the way. So basically what Freud said then is, where does mental illness come from? Well, he said often mental illness is the result of your id puts out a desire that just can't be satisfied. Society won't allow it. Suppose you have a desire to murder small children. Your id is like, yeah, I gotta murder small children. Yeah, let's do that. And Freud's like, well, your superego is going, no, you can't murder small children. And if you can't figure out a way to satisfy that urge within the rules of society, what you'll often do is just repress that urge. I'm not going to listen to that. I'm not going to hear that, see? And so Freud says when you do that, all that energy that wants to murder small children or whatever, it starts to come out in sort of sideways as mental illness, as symptoms of mental illness. And so Freud says things like OCD, this compulsion to do certain things over and over again, is these urges from the id coming out sideways. Or, Freud thought all the schizophrenia and everything were just these ids, these urges from the id that had been tried to repress. They're coming out sideways in all sorts of weird ways. So Freud's answer to this is that you're going to develop talk therapy. You can't physically treat the mind because it's not a physical thing. So instead, Freud said, hey, why don't we can reach the mind through talking. And so what Freud came up with is a whole set of techniques, and there's all sorts of variations of talk therapy beyond Freud. But the idea is that you have a therapist and you talk to the therapist, and the therapist can sort of get clues from what you say as to what's actually going on in your mind. And if you can bring up the issues and really talk through them and confront them directly, you can solve the problem. So for instance, if you're repressing a desire to murder small children, your therapist might be able to get you to talk about it, and once you start talking about the fact that you want to murder small children, you might lose the urge to murder small children, hopefully. So talk therapy was built on the mind-body model, and this idea that by simply talking through things, bringing unconscious urges up to the conscious mind, you can talk about them and resolve the issues. And this is still the foundation for all, when you go to talk to a therapist and cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavioral therapy and all those sorts of things. So during the mid-20th century, talk therapy was it, man. Everybody thought that was the future of psychology. Freud was right, everything was right. But then in the 1980s, the biological organism model makes another big comeback. And that's because we develop a whole bunch of technologies like the PET scan and the fMRI and now the MEG scan that allow us to get better and better information about what's happening in the brain, the physical brain. And in particular, we start to really realize which parts of the brain do what and how the different segments of the brain are networked together and how they function together. And we start to realize how different chemical processes function in the brain, etc. And this is such an astonishing set of discoveries about how the brain works that it really convinces a lot of people that the biological organism model is the way to think about psychology. And it has produced some new drugs for, new types of drugs for various problems with epilepsy or with depressant and et cetera, or anxiety drugs or antipsychosis drugs. But oddly enough, it hasn't produced the types of total cures of mental illness that people had hoped originally. When we started to get all this information about how the brain actually functions at the sort of molecular level, people thought we'd have all sorts of wonder drugs and treatments that could cure all mental illnesses, but it really hasn't produced that yet. But overall, the field of mental health right now is sort of split between these two strains, the mind-body model and biological organism model. The mind-body model is, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, talk therapies of various sorts like that. And then the biological organism model is all your antidepressants, antipsychotic drugs, etc. Or to put it slightly differently, psychologists tend to be mind-body model and psychiatrists tend to be biological organism model people. But there is still a little bit of soul flesh left there. There are therapists who come out of the conservative religious community who think that you can use therapy to address sin And so they think you can do things like conversion therapy to cure homosexuality, or you can do conversion therapy to cure people who are transgender, or you can do therapies to prevent people from doing various sexual acts that are considered sinful. So there's still a little bit of a strain of soul-flesh model in the mental health community. But overall, the field of psychology is mind-body, and the field of psychiatry is focused on the biological organism model. And we'll see where psychology goes from here.